Hi, I'm so glad you're with me here today. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. Now, probably right away when I started reciting those words, you probably recognized the words of that song. Maybe you started following along or singing along with me because those come from the well-known song In the Garden. Perhaps you, like me, I've sung that song many times, and I've done it at funerals, and it's a well-loved song. And it came to my mind today because as we celebrate this Easter Sunday, we're going to look at what Jesus did through the account of the Gospel of John, which takes place in the garden. And so, as we come to this again, we want to see what happened in that garden 2,000 years ago as Jesus suffered on our behalf. What was it that happened? So if you would follow along with me, we're going to read from the Gospel of John, starting in chapter 19 and verse 31, and look at what happened in the garden that day. So listen along as I read from John chapter 19, starting in verse 31. Since it was the preparation day, the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a special day. So they requested that Pilate have the men's legs broken, and that their bodies be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who had been crucified with Jesus. When they came to Jesus, they did not break his legs, since they saw that he was already dead. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth. For these things happened, so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. Also another scripture says, they will look at the one they pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took his body away. Nicodemus, who had previously come to Jesus at night, also came, bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths with the fragrant spices, according to the burial customs of the Jews. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified, a new tomb in the garden. No one had ever yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. She saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she went running to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." At that, Peter and the other disciple went out, heading for the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. Stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then following him, Simon Peter also came. He entered the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there. The wrapping that had been on his head was not lying with the linen cloths, but was folded up in a separate place by itself. The other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, then also went in, saw and believed. For they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she was crying, she stooped to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white, sitting where Jesus' body had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Because they've taken away my Lord," she told them, "and I don't know where they've put him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. "Dear woman," Jesus said to her, "why are you crying? Who is it that you are seeking?" Supposing he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Turning around, she said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus told her, "since I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said to her. So what happened in the garden that day? As the Gospel of John is communicating to it, as John wants to tell us, he points out very strongly that these events took place in a garden. Have you ever wondered why he makes that connection? Well, what happened in the garden that day from that account? What was it that Jesus accomplished? Well, there's three things that we can see from the three scenes that we just read. The first one is the death of Jesus. He died on the cross, he was taken down, and he was buried by two men who were his followers, but in secret: Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And they buried him in a tomb. He was dead and buried in the ground. And Jesus, the seed of the woman, died on a tree and was buried in the ground in a garden. Just as he said in John chapter 12, verse 24, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." The seed of the woman died and was buried in the ground in a garden. The second thing that we can see is that Jesus was raised from the dead, overturning mankind's death and rebellion. Also, as Jesus said in John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? That's what Jesus said. So Jesus was raised from the dead. And then third, he sees Mary. She sees him but doesn't recognize him at first, and then she finally recognizes who he is when he calls her name, and she is overjoyed and clings to him. And then he says, "Don't cling to me, because I'm ascending to the Father." Jesus was going to the Father before the wedding would take place. Again, as Jesus said in John chapter 14, verse 3, "If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Jesus was bringing that news, that message to Mary. So what happened in the garden? What happened in that garden that day was the redeeming of what had happened in the Garden of Eden. That's why John places these events so specifically, mentioning that these took place in the garden, to connect us back to what happened the first man and woman in the Garden of Eden. And so, according to those three things, what is it that really happened? What's the significance of it? Well, the first is that Jesus suffered the consequences of all humanity's destruction and death. The Messiah took the sins of the world upon himself. That's what it means that Jesus died, that he was pierced when he was already dead, that he was taken down, that he was wrapped in linens and placed in a tomb in the ground. Jesus suffered the consequences of humanity's death and destruction. Back on August 10th of 2020, there was a meteorological phenomenon called a derecho, a storm that hit the Midwest and caused a lot of destruction. Hurricane force winds that were estimated up to 140 miles per hour raced across the plains doing damage. $11 billion in damages. In the state of Iowa alone, over 10 million acres of farmland and crops were damaged. That's over a third of the total farmland in the state. And the devastation was great. I've seen devastation like that on a smaller scale, but nothing as great as that. For hundreds of miles, buildings destroyed, crops flattened, and the destruction was great. You can see a picture here from a cornfield that was flattened by this wind. And so after the storm, the full damage had to be reckoned with. And the damage can't just be fixed by simple words, by nice ideas. The full damage had to be reckoned with and restored. Something had to be done, and there were many restorations that had to take place. This is the same reality for us as a human race. We have plunged the world into rebellion and destruction and death. Every violence, every abuse, every selfish action, every pride, every destructive behavior that has taken place has caused damage throughout human history. That death and destruction that was brought by human beings in our disobedience and entering into sin. And Jesus took that full destruction and death upon himself. That's why he had to die, because the solution requires something great. All this devastation throughout human history, wars and destruction and violence and abuse toward one another, it has to be restored. And the restoration has to be something significant. And that's what Jesus did in the garden. Man brought death into the world by disobeying God in the garden and taking the fruit. But Jesus suffered under that death. He suffered under that condemnation and brought life into the world by obeying God. Whatever violence and evil you and I have perpetrated and have suffered, the sacrifice of Christ has the power to overcome that and to heal that, because he came and suffered in his body and died under that death that humanity brought in. He has brought the solution, and it's not platitudes and it's not happy words that we just encourage each other in by saying he is risen. It is the reality that Christ has taken that and suffered that. He has restored and he has dealt with all the damage and all of the destruction of all of human history to bring restoration. That's what happened in the garden. The second thing that happened in the garden that day is that Jesus reversed the curse. The Messiah overturned death and rebellion through his resurrection. Not only the destruction that had taken place, but when mankind sinned, we brought an infection, a pathogen, into the human race that kills 100% of the time. It's 100% lethal. Death reigns. Death and disobedience stalk the human race. No one can escape it. We all, from this sin and death and destruction, we all will return to dust. But Jesus returned to life. The disciples ran and found the tomb empty because Jesus, though he was dead, came back to life. Now there is a solution to death. Jesus is that forerunner. As he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? That's the question. Do you believe that Jesus died and came back to life? You know, I find it interesting in the passage about the disciples look into the tomb, Peter and John, and they don't see anything other than the claws, and then they leave. But when Mary looks into the tomb, she sees the angel. I had somebody explain this to me the other day. We think of that as miraculous appearing, but actually this happens to us on a regular basis. A friend was saying the other day that he had the same experience. He was looking in his refrigerator for the ketchup, and he couldn't find it. And so he asked his wife, and she said, it's in the refrigerator. And then when she came and looked, suddenly it had appeared. The point here of them looking and seeing is that the claws had disappeared. This wasn't some accident. Jesus didn't just wake up. He was dead. And then he came back to life. As he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? And if you do, then one day, if you believe this, one day Jesus, who conquered death and came back to life, will call your name and will say to you, arise, my beloved. And your body will be raised up to see him and to touch him. And your grave will be empty, just as Jesus was. That is what happened when Jesus was resurrected. Death was overturned. The curse was reversed. And our rebellion was overcome. You have a deliverer in Jesus Christ. You have a victor. It is Jesus Christ, God himself, who has defeated our great enemy. That's what happened in the garden that day. And then lastly, what happened in the garden that day was that Jesus indicated the wedding is coming. The Messiah went to prepare a place for us to be with him always. He will take us to be with him always. Have you ever thought it strange in reading this story that after Mary finally recognizes Jesus and understands who he is, she grabs a hold of him and then he says, do not cling to me. And it seems kind of strange. It seems kind of odd. She's happy that he's alive. Why would he say that? But look at what he says. Do not cling to me, verse 17, since I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. What's the reason for her not to cling to him is that he's still ascending. He hasn't ascended yet to the Father. And I think what John is pointing to here through this picture is of a man and a woman in a garden, a man restored to new life and a woman coming to him in a garden. And it's pointing back to that first time that a man and a woman came together in a garden, in the Garden of Eden. And what happened there with Adam and Eve is that there was a consummation. There was a wedding. There was a union between the two. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one. And what Jesus is saying is that the wedding between himself, the groom, and his bride, the church, has yet to come. It was not happening in that moment. He had to ascend to the Father, but he was going to prepare a place and to come and bring us to be with him. This is the language of wedding preparation. The groom goes off to prepare a place, to build the house, the place where they can dwell together. And that's what Jesus is saying. And unlike the first man and woman in this encounter, there is no consummation yet. But the consummation is coming. It's coming. Jesus has gone to the Father to prepare a place, and he's coming back for his bride. And by the way, that place that he's preparing for us is not off there somewhere. It's coming here. That place is going to be here. If you don't believe me, if you're not convinced of that, look at Revelation chapter 21. Verses 1 and 2. The city of God, the New Jerusalem, prepared like a bride for her husband, comes down from heaven to the new earth, where we will dwell with God. But this wedding is not yet. That means that we have the joy and anticipation and expectation, but we also have the waiting. Remember back to your anticipation for your wedding day. If you're married, remember back to that. If you're hoping to be married, think about the anticipation that you have. Maybe you've already made plans for how you want it to be, but think about that preparation. Think about that anticipation. Think about that excitement for that union. That's what we have in Jesus Christ through the resurrection. That's what Easter means. The wedding is not yet, but the wedding is coming. And the meal that we celebrate around the Lord's table on Easter Sunday, coming to take communion, the Eucharist, to come and feast at the table of the King, to partake of him, that is an appetizer, if you will, of the great wedding feast of the Lamb that is coming. It's a preparation for that. So we have excitement. We have anticipation. What a day of rejoicing that will be when we gather together around the table of the King, when we are joined with all of those who follow him, all those who believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and have trusted in him, all the believers around the world. And not only that, all the brothers and sisters that we have fellowship with here today, and also all of those throughout history, be joined together in this great wedding feast. And that's why Jesus said, don't cling to me, because he's going to the Father to come back for this great day. So those are the things that happened in the garden. Jesus is victorious. Jesus is the sacrifice, and Jesus is the groom who's coming again. So this day, today, meet Jesus in the garden. Meet Jesus in the garden. Jesus is the sacrifice. Jesus as the risen victor and the coming groom. Today, meet Jesus again in the garden. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Amen.